Clerk will read.
Item 25 is a recommendation to declare an ordinance amending the municipal code by adding Chapter 5.89 prohibiting the establishment and operation of medical marijuana dispensaries within the city of Long Beach, and by repealing Chapter 5.87 relating to medical marijuana collectives, read the first time and laid over to the next regular meeting of the City Council, and declaring the urgency thereof, and declaring that this ordinance shall take effect immediately.
Mr. Shannon.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, this item was before you some weeks ago and was continued to this date. There was a full hearing. I won't repeat the presentation, of course, that I gave last time, but per your request, you have before you an ordinance that would ban medical marijuana dispensaries in the city of Long Beach and would repeal the present lottery system that we have in existence.
Okay, I just want to point out that the last time this was here, we had an extensive discussion on this by the public well over 2 hours, and we've had it on many occasions. I indicated this would be for council discussion today, and no public testimony would be taken. So, Mr. Chief, did you have comments you wanted to make, or? Chief, did you have any comments you wanted to make? I don't know if you did or not. Is there a presentation from somebody? I don't know. I'm just on.
Mayor, no specific presentation planned, but able to respond to any questions that any of the council may have.
I just wanted to make sure. Councilmember Shipsky. All right, members, we have a discussion before us. We have an item. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I had a brief discussion with the Vice Mayor this morning, and this is a subject that she would like to weigh in on, and I think the entire council should be here for this. And I, for one, believe that we should postpone this until after the hearing. I mean, after the court case is settled. So I'm going to move that we postpone this until the 14th.
14th of what?
February.
Well, then you will not have a settlement of the court case by then. You understand that? You may know whether the Supreme Court will take this case. You will not have it resolved.
Well, I at least put it off until the Supreme Court hears it.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to say you will not have resolution of the issue. I think you should know that. Okay. All you will have is that the court has decided to take it or not take it. And as was stated in the last time when Mr. Shannon and Chief McDonald talked about this, you are in a situation now where you can have a proliferation of collectives and have no ability to deal with that. And I'm just going to state this. I think we need to resolve this issue sooner rather than later. Sooner or later, there's going to be a problem with this, and it is going to become an issue that this council wishes it had resolved. You're both the city attorney and the police chief are telling this council it needs to resolve it. You've been through why we're under a Court of Appeals, in effect, a Court of Appeals decision that says our ordinance is invalid. We need to remove the ordinance. If we don't replace it with something, then you have no control at all. Just make it clear what we're doing. So I'm not asking for comments right now. All right. So do we have a second on Mr. Neal's motion?
Second.
Okay, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, Councilor Neal, I hear what you're saying. I certainly would have preferred for Councilor or Vice Mayor Lowenthal to be here, but we have postponed this once, and I don't think we can postpone it indefinitely. So I'm not really supportive of further, just delay for delay's sake at this point. But I do have a question for the Chief of Police. Chief McDonald, I guess my question is, we've heard different things from people in the community about some of these locations. There has been no crime, there has been no issue. You've indicated to us there have been some crimes, there have been some concerns. So without disclosing any private information or anything that would be inappropriate, can you tell us, has there been a criminal issue at some of these dispensaries, or has there not been an issue?
Yeah, I can respond to that, sir. There is no doubt there has been a lot of criminal issues, to include one murder of a marijuana broker, 81 crime reports, 54 of them felonies, 27 misdemeanors, 20 violent crimes, shootings, robberies, arson, burglaries, money laundering, There's no doubt in my mind that these have been the source of a number of crimes and a drain on police resources.
Okay, and I guess a question for the city attorney. Mr. City Attorney, can you walk us through what is the Supreme Court going to do? What impact would that have on the city? And maybe that would help us as a collectively decide whether or not we should or should not postpone this item tonight.
Yes, as I've indicated in other forums, the Supreme Court will either take the case or not take the case on or before February 8th. It's important, however, to remember that that decision, up or down, does not change, in my opinion, the need for you to take action. If the Supreme Court does not take the case, clearly you have to repeal the ordinance, and again, in my opinion, since there would be no regulations in effect of any significance, and since the ability of the city to effectively regulate dispensaries would be gone, you would need to ban them in order to protect the public health and safety. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Court takes the case, which I hope they will, because the law in this area is very unclear, if they take the case, there will be a 9 to 12-month hiatus in which there will be no regulations in effect because we will have no effective ordinance at all. And we will revert to that particular period of time, the lawless period of time in which there were no regulation of dispensaries, at least for the 9 to 12-month period that the Supreme Court is considering its decision. So in either event, whether the Supreme Court takes the case or does not take the case, there is a need for you to act, in my opinion, to ban dispensaries in Long Beach.
So just so I understand that, Mr. Shannon, so what you're saying is if the court were to take the case and then hear that 9 or 12 months later, in that interim period, your legal position is that we would not have the legal ability to regulate those dispensaries as we have been in the past?
Not in any effective way, not in any affirmative way.
Okay, well, my concern is I hear what Mr. Neal is saying, Councilmember Neal, but I'm not sure if in 2 months or 3 months we're going to have any different opinion. So I think the council should vote tonight.
Councilmember Gavlich.
Thank you, Mayor. Actually, if I can just remind everybody that it was just a couple of weeks ago when Suja sat here and really lobbied us all to wait for Robert to be here. And unfortunately, now the tables have turned and now she's not here. And she did make the phone call requesting that we do postpone this so she can be available and participate in this process. But more importantly, well, equally as importantly as that, because I would want to be here as well. I would like my position after all the work that we've done over the last several years to, for my voice to be heard. But I have a question about what I'm hearing, and I know that there's that concern that we could be liable and that, that we still are putting ourselves at risk. But I'm reading here that unless the Supreme Court specifically orders the publication of the PAC appellate decision when it grants the review, the granting of the review will render the appellate decision unenforceable against the city until their decision is made. Would you agree with that?
No, I would not. In fact, the fact of the matter is that until the Supreme Court finally rules, our ordinance is ineffective.
Okay, but are you saying that what I'm reading here, and I've read it a couple of different times, that should the Supreme Court grant the review, that the decision then by the appellate court is not enforceable until the Supreme Court makes their decision on
that is not correct in the way in which you've termed it. Yes, it's true. If the Supreme Court takes the case, the Court of Appeal decision is in limbo. But you still have in existence the opinion of 3 very respected jurists that our ordinance is unconstitutional because it violates federal law, and that any affirmative action that you took to permit dispensaries would be unlawful. So under those circumstances, it would be ludicrous for you to try to enforce an ordinance that has been declared unenforceable.
When you say the jurists, what jurists are you referring to?
3 jurists on the Court of Appeal.
Okay, the judges on the Court of Appeal. For the PAC decision? Am I mixing this up?
Yes.
Yes, for the PAC decision. So what we've done is appeal it to the Supreme Court, and it's going to sit at the Supreme Court's decision, not the appellate court's decision.
Ultimately, on the day that the Supreme Court decides that's correct, the Supreme Court decision will hold sway. They could simply affirm the PAC decision, or they could do any one of a number of different things.
Absolutely.
But until they did that, it would be very imprudent very ill-advised for you to try to enforce an ordinance that has been previously declared unenforceable and unlawful.
So that means, if I'm understanding you correctly, that trying to remove the folks that did not participate in the permit process, to remove them from the streets, that would be illegal?
No, that's not what I said.
Okay, tell me again. So
The opinion of the Court of Appeal implicitly allowed the city to ban all dispensaries. That's not just my opinion, it's the opinion of attorneys up and down the state. Because it said in essence that the city of Long Beach cannot affirmatively regulate that which is illegal. From that it follows that the city can affirmatively ban that which is illegal under federal law.
I understand. I know you keep saying the same thing, and I think I'm continuing to say the same thing. My question is, it sounds like if the Supreme Court, prior to or by February the 8th, accepts to take this, then we can stand still until they make the decision whether or not to honor the decision made in the case.
You can conceivably stand still, however, but in the interim there will be no ability of the city to enforce any meaningful regulations that regulate these dispensaries. The very reason why you entered into the first ordinance, into the ordinance in the first place.
Okay, well, I think, what we're talking about here is a period of 2 weeks. I think...
No, we're talking
3
about a
weeks.
period of 9 months to a year, probably closer to a year.
For their decision. Oh, I see what you're saying. I mean, you're going on, that just stops everything. So the folks that didn't participate in the process can continue to open their doors, and we have no control over it.
No. If you impose a ban, you'll effectively be able to prevent any of the dispensaries from keeping their doors open or opening their doors.
Well, I'm trying to find a legal way to support the process that we started, to support the people that went through the process that we put in place.
And what
To
I'm
stay
telling
there.
you
You're
is that
saying
there
we
is
can't.
no legal way in the next 9 to 12 months that you can do that.
Well, I think I still disagree, but you're the lawyer. Let somebody else have the floor.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question for Mr. Neal. Look, I would prefer to vote on this evening. We set it up to vote on it this evening, but I'm hearing there's some concerns about voting on it without a Councilmember Lowenthal present. Listen, I'm fine with voting on it without her, but it seems like some people want her present. So what if we just delayed this a week? Could we do it next week?
I won't be here.
Okay, so is everybody going to be here on Valentine's Day?
Are you? Do you have a date?
I'll be here.
I don't know.
That was the reason for that particular day.
How do you know everyone's going to be here the 14th?
Is there anyone on the council that's not going to be here on the 14th?
But they might not know. I mean, we just heard this morning that one of us isn't here today.
Okay.
It would have been convenient to hear it, earlier in the week.
The 14th is the next available date when everyone is scheduled to be here.
One at a time. Mr. O'Donnell has the floor.
I'm just wondering if there's some compromise that we can find right now to get this voted on so that the people know where we're going. I mean, we just delay it. I mean, vote to keep the ordinance the way it is if that's what we really want. You've heard that there's some danger in doing that apparently, but
Can I comment on that, Mr.
yeah,
O'Donnell?
go ahead, Mr. Mayor. I'm done.
Let me try to reiterate the problem again. We don't really have an enforceable ordinance right now. We have no ability to enforce it. This council tried to do the right thing. I give you a lot of credit. You tried to be able to set up a structure in which you could have responsible people conduct themselves in this activity under your rules, with your inspection, with growing the product here in Long Beach, trying to limit as much as you can illegal and nefarious activity around this product. That's no longer possible. You're under a Court of Appeals decision that says our ordinance is invalid. It's not the outcome we wanted. I don't know if it's the outcome the appellants, the people who filed the lawsuit wanted. If the Supreme Court takes it, if they don't take it, we're still in the situation we have an invalid ordinance. And here's the problem. You have no ability to stop anything without an ordinance banning it. You can't do anything. You can't inspect. You can't stop new collectors from coming in. You have no ability. It'll be where we were early on, which is I kind of call the Wild West period, in which anybody can open one of these businesses, and that's primarily what they are. So we do have legitimate needs of people who need medical marijuana. We need to find a way to have those met. It's still under the law able to do that. But for this city to protect itself from a proliferation of these businesses, you either ban it now or shortly, or it's going to be wide open. Now, the only question I have, Mr. Shannon, is it possible that the Supreme Court would stay the Court of Appeals decision, and what effect would that have on the ordinance?
No, a stay, that question was asked earlier of me today. There's no conceivable way that the Supreme Court would basically a stay in this context. It's not really a stay. It would be a writ of mandate, mandating that the ordinance be reinstated. There's no way the Supreme Court's going to do that, because by doing that they would have essentially ruled on the merits before all the parties had a chance to brief it. The Supreme Court does not act in that fashion.
I got it. So look, I know this is a difficult decision. We've talked about this almost ad nauseum, and I think there's plenty of information on this council to make a decision. If all I can tell you is that in the month that you would potentially wait under Mr. Neal's motion, I don't know what will happen in that intervening month, whether another 5, 10, 20, 30 businesses spring up in Long Beach that you're now going to have to go back and potentially close, or there may be some other issues, and Chief McDonald understands some of the problems that occur there. And if that occurs in the interim, that delay, you may have prevented that. You have to understand that. So that's where we are. Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A few things. The Vice Mayor, I know, who's very interested in the subject, also put the same phone call into me, so I understand where you're coming from, Mr. Neal. Just a couple things I wanted to maybe ask our chief. I know that, and I think people in the community recognize this, that there are certainly dispensaries out there right now, collectives that are they're certainly trying to do the right thing. They're providing access for those that have a prescription for whether it's cancer, or whether they're dealing with some other type of disease, HIV. They have a legitimate use for the medical cannabis, and I think that's, at the end of the day, those of us that are trying to provide, or at least provide a path to those that actually need to have the safe access, is what we're trying to do. At the same time, and I think many of you out there recognize that there are dispensaries out there that are absolutely horrible neighbors. There is crime that's occurring. There is some really bad things happening at a lot of these locations, and quite frankly, these dispensaries are the ones that aren't in the permitting process. At least the ones that I've had a chance to observe. And these illegal operators that are not part of our process are causing major neighborhood disturbances. And it's my hope that activity that's happening, particularly outside of these dispensaries, that we're doing everything that we can with our force to ensure and crack down on those activities. At the same time, I know there's a lot of other public safety concerns, and I know it's also a new area, so it's something that we're all trying to come up with a solution together. I'd ask Mr. Neal. I think it's important for there to be a full council. That's what I would like to personally see. I also think that we are on a very expedited schedule, and we have to make a decision as soon as possible, because this is, I think the mayor does make good points as far as the timeline. Mr. Neal, I think that for us to be able to make this decision at the next available meeting, that we have a full council, would be important. It's something that I would support. But I will be supporting the delay for the vice mayor. At the same time, I would encourage our police department, and I've had conversations as early as yesterday night with our city prosecutor, that we need to put down the full extent of the law on those that are breaking the law very publicly in these communities, and we need to stop that as soon as possible. And so that's my hope, and I'd be happy to wait for the vice mayor, but at the same time, we got to crack down on the bad guys.
Okay, just one comment on that, Mr. Garcia, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. We have no law right now. We have no law. So how can you, if you say, I'm going to close down someone who did not comply with the ordinance, but leave someone who complied with the ordinance open, on what basis do you do that?
Mr. Mayor, I'm also referring to the activity that's happening outside of the collective,
Okay,
which
I
has been
understand
the
that,
bigger,
but we're
the
going
bigger
to enforce
neighborhood.
that law no matter what.
And I'm saying, I think that obviously we need to be as vigilant, particularly in light of what's going on around the collectives that are having these problems, and being particularly the ones that are illegal and not in our permitting process.
Okay, I would just argue that, then we're going after symptoms, not causes, and that's really what some of this issue is. And we need to get at the cause as soon as possible. Mr. Neal.
Okay, I just had a couple of questions in regard to enforcement. Chief, since the PAC decision, can you explain how enforcement has been impacted?
Just to clarify a couple of points that were made, all of this revolves around the Compassionate Use Act that was enacted in 1996. The word prescription was used. There is no prescription because marijuana is against federal law. It is a recommendation by a limited amount of doctors who are willing to do that and give it to people. It is still against federal and state law to do what we're doing here. It's permitted by this city administratively, basically a business permit. It's still against the law. So by your action in putting us in the position we're in, you've hamstrung our ability to be able to enforce the law as a police department. So since the PAC decision or before the PAC decision, we're still in the same position.
Okay, with that, I'd like to call for the question.
Well, we have a couple people who want to speak. You can call for the question. It will take 2/3. But Mr. DeLong has not spoken. Mr. DeLong.
Thank you. I have two questions. First, I'd like to follow up with the chief. But help me understand why you don't feel you have the ability currently to go after those illegally operating businesses that never went through the permit process, so aren't even quasi-legitimate. I mean, why don't you feel you have state and federal law to be able to go after and close those down?
You've got a system where we could go out potentially and make an arrest that we know will not be filed by either the district attorney or the city attorney because the city has permitted marijuana collectives within the city. Whether or not they complied from an administrative standpoint with what the city's regulations were affect the ability for us to get a prosecution. So,
but if the city attorney has said that those regulations are by the wayside now given the PAC decision, so they don't exist, what prevents you tomorrow from going out and closing those establishments down?
we're still in the same position. We could go out there and make an arrest, but we're wasting resources in making that arrest because we're not going to get a prosecution because of the situation that as it sits in this city right now.
And why won't the city prosecutor or district attorney, why would they not prosecute those cases?
Because where the city has not outrightly banned collectives in the city, then the issue we're dealing with is not whether marijuana collectives are illegal or not. The situation is, whether they were, through an administrative process, permitted by the city to do what they're doing.
But again, I guess if I think of a city down the road that hasn't done anything affirmatively, they haven't banned them, they haven't regulated them, they haven't done anything, is there not state and federal law that would say that's an illegally operating business and their law enforcement resources would be able to close those businesses down? I mean, why would their city council or other legislative bodies need to take an affirmative action to ban them? Why doesn't law enforcement have the ability to close those down?
Well,
The city,
first of all, state authorities are not enforcing because of the existence of the Compassionate Use Act, and the fact of the matter is that the federal law is not being enforced by the federal authorities, and so we have an ineffective system, a totally ineffective system, because of the illogic, as I've said so many times, the illogic of the state law versus federal law, which needs to be clarified. But the bottom line is that many dispensaries spawn illegal activity. If we don't have the ability either to regulate those dispensaries such that we can prevent that illegal activity, or in the alternative to ban them, then we have no effective way to prevent the illegal activity.
Thank you. So back to the chief.
Yeah.
So help me understand that. I mean,
Okay.
Are you saying that another city their law enforcement cannot close these dispensaries if they have not taken an affirmative action to ban them?
if the
Even
city,
if they're in violation of every law existing?
right, if the city took no action at all, then it would be clean. State and federal law applies. Where the city has tried to regulate collectives, it now becomes an administrative process where it muddies the water, and from a prosecution standpoint, it makes it extremely difficult for us to work with that.
Okay, so we've made it murky by having by doing the regulation.
Absolutely.
But if PAC has set those aside, aren't we in the same position of all those other cities now and being able to have law enforcement go after and pursue those? I mean, I just feel like I'm getting a mixed message. On the one hand, I feel like I'm being told I have no regulations, we can't employ those. But on the other hand, I'm being told, well, it's because you have those regulations, we can't enforce the law. And it just seems to me that which is it? I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing. It's got to be one or the other. I don't understand how it's.
I wish it was one or the other, because it would make our job a lot easier and allow us to be able to do what we need to do. The fact that the city has weighed in and allowed some to do it, we will not get a prosecution at this point on it until that point is clarified.
And is it the city prosecutor or district attorney? I mean, who is the prosecuting authority in these types of cases?
If it's a misdemeanor, it's the city prosecutor. If it's a felony, it's the district attorney.
And if you're trying to close down dispensary, which jurisdiction would it fall under?
Depends on the crime that we made the arrest for.
And which do you think you would make it under, a felony or a misdemeanor?
Likely a felony.
Okay. All right, thank you. I did have another question for the city attorney, and I hate to pick up where Councilmember Gablich left off, but it's also fuzzy to me on what impact the Supreme Court action has if it decides to hear the case. Does it set aside the superior or the appellate court or not?
The fundamental assumption here is that the Supreme Court, in taking the case, is somehow disapproving of the Court of Appeal opinion.
Well, I think there's a difference between disapproving versus putting off to the side entirely.
But it would be totally imprudent for us to go back to the very ordinance that a Court of Appeal has told us is unconstitutional, and not only that, but could possibly lead to criminal filings against the people in the city that affirmatively permitted these dispensaries. It would be the height of folly to go back to that ordinance just by virtue of the fact that the Supreme Court took the case.
And I recognize, your perspective from a best practices, from a business management. I understand.
Well, it's more than that. There's no way I could permit any city official from enforcing an ordinance that a Court of Appeal, whether or not the Supreme Court has taken the case, that a Court of Appeal has told them is not only unlawful, but could subject them to criminal prosecution. That is, I hope you can understand that is not a very prudent decision for a city attorney to make.
And I do understand that. I'm just trying to get a better understanding of the legality of what happens legally when if the Supreme Court takes the case. What impact does that have on the appellate court decision? And also, what was the original decision if it was appealed to an appellate court? What was the lower court? Was there a lower court that made a decision on this that I don't recall at the moment?
There was a decision in the lower court that basically was reversed by the Court of Appeal, yes.
And what decision did the lower court make?
Basically had indicated that the ordinance was appropriate and was actually was taken away from the lower court before any final disposition was made. So no effectively final decision was made by the lower court.
So there was no ruling by the lower court, it just got kicked out?
There were preliminary rulings, but at some point in time the plaintiff appealed to the Court of Appeal and said this shouldn't go any further because there's this issue, and the Court of Appeal yanked it from the trial court.
Now, thank you for that. So back to the appellate court. So if the Supreme Court takes the case, what impact does that have on the appellate court's ruling?
The appellate court ruling is in limbo.
Okay. So it's not overturning it. It's not going the other way.
Certainly not overturning it. Keep in mind that if you read the Court of Appeal opinion in Peck, it can be read to be said that they want the Supreme Court to take this opinion. They want the Supreme Court to consider it because it admits that the law in California is in disarray and that the Court of Appeals are not in full agreement. But remember that the Supreme Court could easily be taking the case to affirm the PAC decision and thereby clarify the law. There's a number of ways that the law can be clarified, and one of them is for the Supreme Court to put the stamp of approval on PAC and basically make PAC the law of California.
So what's our liability if the city, and I understand it's not a great idea, I'm just trying to figure out what the alternatives are. If the city went forward and it continued with its regulations, and then 9 to 12 months later the Supreme Court rules and it affirms the appellate decision and says, nope, the appellate court was absolutely right, we're ruling in favor of PAC, cities, you can't do this, what would be our
Well,
financial
there's a whole
exposure?
bunch of possibilities, including contempt of the judicial process. And as I say, and I hate to keep repeating myself, but the PAC court did say it, the possible subjecting of city officials from top to bottom to criminal liability.
Anything else?
Well,
I mean, I'd never really be the mayor at that point.
Let's put it this way.
But thank you for that advice. But what other? I mean, are there financial penalties? I mean, is the city open up to additional lawsuits? What's our worst case scenario?
I don't want to speculate. I mean, there are civil ramifications in terms of possible financial penalties, but I just don't think it's profitable to speculate on all the range of possibilities that could occur. Well, it's not going to happen. We're not going to continue to enforce this ordinance during the period of time that the Supreme Court is considering the decision.
Well, there you have it. Thank you.
Just can I follow up one question there, Mr. Shannon? I can understand if the Supreme Court decides to take the case and then why it wouldn't stay the Peck decision. But Mr. DeLong, I understand his point as well, which is that if in fact you don't enforce the ordinance or you have no ability to enforce the ordinance, that's also in effect prejudging the outcome in some ways. There's no ability in that interim period to do anything relative to this.
Nothing that's inconsistent with the PAC decision.
So even at,
Because of the risk that the Supreme Court is going to simply approve of the PAC decision.
okay,
I mean, we're talking about the most prudent action to take.
Yeah, I understand.
I mean, if you in a theoretical world, if you wanted to roll the dice, let's say this, of course, only under the circumstances if the Supreme Court took it. If you wanted to roll the dice and continue to enforce the ordinance during that interim period, and you wanted to bet that the Supreme Court was going to say, no, the PAC court, you were totally wrong. The city was absolutely right. Its lottery was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then there would be no liability. But who in the world wants to take that chance?
Yeah, I understand. I understand the prudence of it. I understand not wanting to take the chance. And I would add one other thing. I was just thinking while you were saying this. If you tried to enforce the ordinance, and what you would do is you would take those who complied with the ordinance and basically leave them under the present organization and regime in the ordinance. But if you tried to prevent someone from opening a new collective, they would point to the Peck decision and say you have no authority to do that. So even if you tried to enforce your ordinance, I'm not sure you'd render it very effective. Just point that out. I mean, you agree with that, Mr. Shannon?
Yes, that's true.
Well, but Mr. Mayor, I mean, I think that's, I mean, I understand that for those that we're trying to send through a regulatory process for them to point out and say, no, it doesn't exist according to the PAC decision. But for those that didn't qualify, it would seem to me that we're in the same position as any other city that didn't do any regulation to say, no, the law says that you're an illegal. We're not going to let you operate. We're going to put you out of business. I mean, to me, it gets to the law enforcement as the district attorney, if it's felony, or the city prosecutor. Are they willing to prosecute these cases?
Well, I think you're in the worst of all worlds. My understanding is the DA is not going to prosecute them if you have an ordinance regulating them. If you now try to enforce an ordinance that regulates them, that is also declared to be unconstitutional by a court of appeals, I don't see a DA that's going to touch a case against a collective that came in outside your ordinance. I don't see why they would do that. I mean, the answer I heard, and Mr. Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong, is that once the city has moved to occupy the area, if you want to occupy the field on regulation, the DA has not been prosecuting those cases.
That's my understanding. Actually, the chief is more familiar with that, but that's my understanding.
Well,
yes.
Maybe we should get that confirmed at some point. But
I guess, I mean, I'd like to understand, even not just from a Long Beach perspective, but if you look at the district attorney's territory, I'd like to understand which of these cases are they prosecuting and which are they declining to try and get a better
I think that's a prudent question, Mr. Dolan. I do.
May I suggest that you might want to take a few steps back to those interminable hearings you had that ended up with the ordinance that you put into place. The reason you put into place the ordinance, I would suggest, is that you were satisfied that the laws were not sufficiently effective to regulate dispensaries. You wanted them to continue to exist on a limited basis, but that you recognized that there was a need for them to be regulated for the health and safety of the city. That's why you put the ordinance in place. Now, clearly, the PAC case has eliminated that ordinance, so now we're back to that original situation. And if the problem exists as it existed before the ordinance went into effect, then I would argue your only alternative during this interim period is to ban the dispensaries in order to meet that problem, that very same problem that existed before you enacted the ordinance.
If you accept the conclusion that the PAC decision eliminated it, I agree with you, but I guess that's where I'm trying to get some clarity from a district attorney perspective is that the position they're in? They say, yes, we'll enforce it against other cities that didn't do anything, but I'm sorry, Long Beach, because you made an effort to regulate, we're not going to prosecute anything that comes out of the city of Long Beach.
I could talk to that if I could. The practice has been for the district attorney for cities that have not attempted to regulate, they are pursuing prosecution. For cities that have taken the position as we have, where we tried to regulate it, the district attorney is not prosecuting those cases that have been approved by the city or other ones.
Those that are not. So.
Those that are not permitted by the city, right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeLong. We have a call for the question. Is there any objection? Seeing no objection, members, on Mr. Neal's motion to move this to February 14th, cast your votes on that.
Mr. Mayor, just clarification, is the motion to move it to the 14th or to the next available meeting?
That's so far when everybody's here, Mr. Garcia. All right? To the 14th. Members, on that motion, cast your votes.
Motion carries. 5 votes yes, 3 votes no.
Okay, my members, I just urge you, we need to get this decided, and hopefully the 14th is the day. Thank you all. Appreciate the discussion. In the meantime, Mr. Shannon, I'd like to get, I think it would be useful to get a more complete understanding of the DA's practices. I think that's a good question. Okay. Well, we'll see where the interest is here.